Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to Restorative Justice 101. The agenda for tonight is pretty simple and straightforward. We'll open in prayer, and then we'll hear from our keynotes, and then I will wrap it up with where are we with restorative justice in Williamson County. And without further ado, Ms. Kathy Harms.
Good evening, everyone. If you could just take a seat, and we'll open with prayer. If you could just bow your head, and we'll ask the Lord to be with us tonight. Father, we're just so grateful for the families and the parents and the grandparents and the leaders of our community that are here tonight, Father, to be instructed once again, Father, in healthy boundaries and discipline, Father, because your word tells us that none of us, not an adult or a child, should ever despise the discipline of the Lord, because he corrects those whom he loves. And that kind of correction and discipline leads to self-discipline, it leads to order, and it leads to security. And we ask then tonight, Father, that you would bless our speakers, that you would give them wisdom, that we would be able to restore godly order, godly boundaries, and discipline among our children, the kind that is much more powerful than the lies of the culture, much more powerful than the confusion and the violence that we see today among our youth, much more powerful than the false sense of justice that we are giving our children, and much, much more powerful than the empty philosophy and the deceit that is being permeated among our culture and among our youth. So tonight we thank you for this. We come expecting, knowing that your righteousness and justice are the very bedrock and foundation of your throne, and that your love, your steadfast love, goes before you. We just pray these things and expect good things tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Kathy. I'd like to introduce myself. Good evening. I am the Moms for Liberty Williamson County Chapter Chair. I'm an Air Force veteran, having flown the B-1 bomber. I'm a wife to a husband for 12 years, and now a full-time mom of 3 beautiful children, ages 2, 6, and 8. Since leaving the military, I have felt called into service once again, this time in the defense of the children of our country, and our country as we work to inform, equip, and empower parents, grandparents, and citizens in the battle for their children. We started this chapter in April 2021, and here we are almost 2 years later. This event, as most of you know by now, is part of our 2022 to 2023 school year for parents. We've already covered critical race theory, social emotional learning, gender ideology, and this month we're focusing on restorative justice, which can in fact have life or death consequences for our children. As we focus on this topic in the month of January, what does that mean? Well, this is what we do. First of all, our book club reads a book about it, Why Meadow Died, of which one of our speakers was the co-author. We've put on Restorative Justice 101 tonight, and then we've got a follow-on 102 next week that's virtual. Working on the Restorative Justice True-False quiz for parents, so you can see how much you learned in the month of January. And the toolkit will be live later this week and being built. So we build the toolkits as we go, because like you, most of these months, I start with about this much knowledge on the subject. And after getting ready for tonight, I've got this much knowledge on the subject. And we're gonna upload all of that to our parent toolkit so that if you have any questions about restorative justice, it's right there at your fingertips. So what is it? Like most left ideologies, restorative justice sounds really nice. It sounds like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's hard to say that you're not for it. I mean, before this, I always thought of restorative yoga. That was great. So restorative justice, how can it be bad? The name itself is confusing, and it puts parents to sleep because it does not sound dangerous. It sounds pleasant. So I think that's why it's even more important for us to put a fine point on it. What is restorative justice? And to help everybody understand the very real and dangerous consequences that such a nice sounding ideology can have. And in order to do that, I have put together a short video. Excuse me, I'm an amateur video maker, and I had the idea to do this yesterday afternoon. But I think it will help make the point that we're trying to hammer home.
We know that Latino kids are almost twice as likely as white kids to be suspended from school. Black kids are nearly 4 times as likely. And if a student has been suspended even once by the time they're in 9th grade, they are twice as likely to drop out. And that's why my administration has been working with schools on alternatives to the so-called zero-tolerance guidelines. By making sure our criminal justice system doesn't just function as a pipeline for underfunded schools to overcrowded jails, we can help young men of color stay out of prison.
This picture capturing kids trapped helplessly in a crammed hallway. 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz seen here loading an AR-15 in the hallway of Stoneman Douglas High School as a frightened freshman walks past. Moments later, Cruz killing 17 students and staff.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Before the authorities had released the name of the shooter, all the students knew who it was. Everybody knew who it was without even seeing it.
In a season of loss, it is difficult to find meaning in tragedy. The senseless murder of so many, including my own beloved daughter, Elena. Nicholas Cruz and the deadly danger he posed were the worst kept secrets in Parkland, with one inexcusable exception. He was kept a secret from many of the parents of the students.
And even if he were, Broward Sheriff's Union President Jeff Bell says that his school resource officer hands were tied because the schools didn't want the bad numbers. This matters far beyond Broward County. Superintendent Runcie has said, and I quote, "Some of my staff joke that the Obama administration might have taken our policies and framework and developed them into national guidelines. That's not funny because it's not a joke."
Gun in a middle school.
2 stabbings in 2 different high schools.
And multiple fights caught on camera in buildings throughout the Akron Public School District.
Teachers every single day because they are afraid to be in the classrooms, to be in the schools.
Davis is calling for the resignation of Superintendent Dr. Calvin Watts. She says the district's new discipline policy is a catastrophe and hasn't stopped repeated acts of violence.
The student begins punching him again and again.
Me with both of his fists balled up tightly and said, "I'm not going around and he brushed past me, and he said, F you, and exited through the door. Could I finish, please? About 2 more minutes.
Oh, we can't do 2 minutes, but if you could wrap up.
Please.
Can you wrap up your statement? Yeah.
Okay, on August 24th, I need to finish. Yeah. On August the 24th, 2021.
Ma'am, I have to be fair with everybody. If you could share your last sentence, and then.
I am a teacher, and I was assaulted by a student, and you all need to do something about it because it's trying to be pushed under the carpet, okay?
We'll have staff connect with you. So
let me talk, please. The student became aggressive by pushing me hard into the steel doors and took his elbow and jabbed me very hard in my spine and back. He sent the right side of my body into the doors. I suffered multiple injuries and I still cannot get treatment for my neck, right knee, or upper back. It was unacceptable, and the student should have been arrested and charged with assault and battery with intent to commit bodily harm.
Other educators added when teachers are attacked, they are told not to report it.
It's a brutal back-to-school season across the country, spread all over social media. Police officers injured, students arrested at this high school in Florida. A 13-year-old arrested for allegedly attacking a student with autism in California.
ED tells me no charges were filed, and also that student was not arrested.
And violence so bad, the superintendent closed the school and ordered a day of remote learning.
You're in a situation now where somebody is going to die.
We do have a child on the line. Hello? No, there's a school shooting.
Okay, yes, ma'am. I have multiple units there. Are you with officers or are you barricaded somewhere?
I'm in classroom number 112. 112, yes, ma'am.
What's your name, ma'am?
Early 3:30. There's a lot of dead bodies. My dad taught me when I was a little girl. Send help when my teachers are still alive, but they're shot.
320. Go ahead with that child's information relay.
Officer child is advising he is in the room full of victims at this moment.
So, restorative justice. Ryan and Max are going to go into way more depth than I can, but the high points are, it started in the prison systems. It was never meant for the schools. It was spearheaded in Broward County with the Promise program. That helped to produce the Parkland shooter. But Obama's administration took that program and made it the model for the entire country and pushed it out via a joint DOE, Department of Ed, and Department of Justice Dear Colleague letter, which is kind of an end run around the law. If you've ever seen that letter, I don't even know how many pages it is because the PDF just keeps going and going and going and going. After Parkland, it was rescinded, but not really. The roots of it has taken root into our school systems. It jeopardizes students, it jeopardizes teachers, it removes consequences, it removes law enforcement, and it skews the statistics to make itself look good, like it's doing a wonderful thing in your schools, when in fact it's just playing with the numbers and it's hiding the truth. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Ryan Petty. Ryan Petty lost his daughter Elena in the tragic school shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School on Valentine's Day 2018. Since then, Ryan and his wife Kelly have been actively involved in the public policy arena as advocates for improving school safety through early identification and intervention of potential threats. Ryan was appointed in March 2018 by Governor Rick Scott to serve on the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Public Safety Commission. Ryan was appointed by Governor DeSantis to the Florida State Board of Education in January of 2020. He is a board member of Stand With Parkland and is the co-founder of the Walk Up Foundation, an organization whose mission is to protect children and teachers at school through the support of evidence-based policies and programs. He has come here tonight to share his story. Please give him a warm welcome, Mr. Ryan Petty.
Thank you, Robin, for that kind introduction. Thank you for having me here today to Williamson County. It's an honor for me to be here this evening to talk a little bit about my experience in restorative justice. Couple of things. We're coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the Parkland massacre. In 5 years, since we lost our sweetheart, Elena, who was a freshman and was a genuinely wonderful young lady with so much potential. We miss her. They say that time heals all wounds, and so far it hasn't. There's a hole in our heart, and we're working as best as we know how to try to fill that hole. Part of that has been work to try to make sure what happened in Parkland doesn't happen anywhere else in the country. Now, I know that's, I say that knowing that it's happened several times since Parkland, and it's happened in places like Parkland where they thought, as my wife and I did, it can't happen here. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that led up to the tragedy in Parkland, some of the mistakes that were made, and then Max Eden, who will be introduced shortly, will come up and talk a little bit more about some of the policy, the history of restorative justice and the policies that we find in schools across the country. Let me start by saying that I'd like to think my wife and I are good parents. We did what we thought was the best for our kids. One of the reasons we ended up in Parkland, of all places, was that we understood Parkland had an A-rated school. It was a good school with dedicated teachers and administrators, dedicated parents and families, and this was the place in Broward County to live if you cared about the education that your kids got. So we thought we were doing the right thing by moving there, and we thought that was sort of the end of our responsibility. Now, I know I'm not naive to think that's the end of our responsibility, but it was certainly, we thought we had done the right things. We thought we had put our kids in the right schools, and we thought things were good, but there were warning signs. And my biggest regret as a father is that I didn't listen to all of the warning signs that I was hearing from my kids that were attending these schools. The things that were happening in the classroom, the things that were happening in between classes, the things that were happening after school. They weren't massive problems. They were some of the things that I experienced growing up, and I'm sure most of you did too, the fights after school and some things like that. But the part that I wasn't tuned into, the part that I didn't understand, was the way the school was dealing with the kinds of things that even we grew up with, the fights and the disruptions in class. What I didn't know at the time, and I had never heard the term restorative justice until I met Max Eden after the tragedy. Didn't know what it was. Never heard the term. I'd never heard it used by any of my children's teachers. My wife, who has volunteered at every school that my kids have gone to, from the time they were in kindergarten till the time our youngest son graduated from high school, had never heard that term used. We didn't know that restorative justice practices were being implemented or had been implemented in the school district where we chose to raise our kids and where they attended school. So let me quote something. I just want to, I think it's important to make the point that you have to be listening and attuned to the language that's being used. Listen to the school board members, listen to the administrators, listen to the teachers and those that are responsible for protecting your kids and teaching your kids what they say. So I'm going to quote Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass here. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, and that's all. I share that with you because the left are masters of using language and taking words and making them mean what they want them to mean, not necessarily what you believe or think they mean. So when Max first started talking to me about restorative justice, after Elena had been killed and after we were dealing with the aftermath, my first inclination was, well, it sounds reasonable. Restorative justice. I think I understand what that means, but my thinking couldn't have been further from the truth. And I'll tell you a little bit about the program that was implemented in Broward County, and Max will elaborate on what I'm saying. But here's what I want you to understand. Right after we had moved to Broward County, there was a school bond that was put forward for $800 million. Now, Broward County is a massive school district. Let me give you a sense for how large it is. There are 235 schools, about 270,000 students in this school district. This is a massive district. The way we do school districts in Florida is by county. The counties are rather large. This is a big operation. It would probably be a Fortune 100 company. It's got a $4 billion a year operating budget. This is a massive enterprise. Before we moved there, the school board hired a superintendent named Robert Runcie. And Max will probably talk a little bit more about Robert Runcie. But as Robin mentioned earlier, Robert Runcie came from the Chicago School District. He was an acolyte of Arne Duncan, former Secretary of Education. And he he had learned from Arnie Duncan all about restorative justice in these programs. So when he became superintendent of Broward County, this is the 6th largest school district in the country, it was his chance to experiment on the students and families in Broward County with this restorative justice program. And when I say experiment, it was absolutely an experiment. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. Let me tell you what this program, what it stood for. Promise program, preventing recidivism through opportunities, mentoring, intervention, supports, and education. The left is really good with acronyms, aren't they? They come up with these acronyms that make things sound really good. That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Preventing recidivism. We got kids that are getting into trouble. We should try to prevent that. Sounds like a good thing to do. They pitched it as the Promise program represents the most comprehensive thinking available to address socially unacceptable and or school-related infractions that could result in a juvenile arrest. And the way they sold it to the community was by saying that there are racial and economic disparities in how students are disciplined. Therefore, we need a program like Promise to, they didn't use the term equalize, but they used equity, to provide equity and social justice to the discipline policies in the student. Never mind whether or not, let's forget for a moment the behavior that caused the infraction, that caused the issue. Let's just look at it in aggregate and look at the numbers and look at how the numbers break down by race and socioeconomic group and by school, and let's try to equalize those. Let's try to get equity. Let's make sure there's equity. So if we have a student of color that's acting up in a classroom, let's not punish that student. Let's not do what we would normally do through discipline. And Max will talk a little bit more, I think, about what that looked like. But the practical effect was this superintendent was very popular in the community at the time. He was so popular that the county voted for an $800 million expansion, the school bond program to renovate schools and improve safety and security and improve technology, $800 million, so he'd gotten that through. And what we found out later on, after denials by the school district and the superintendent himself, that the Parkland killer had been involved in the Promise program. He denied it at first and then was caught. The reason we know it wasn't really a program, and when I say the emperor had no clothes, what I mean is it was little more than a public relations campaign and some PowerPoints and some policies that were pushed out to the district, to the school administrators and to teachers that basically said, look, if you discipline a student, particularly a student of color, you do it disproportionately to the other students in the class, you're going to be in trouble. That was sort of what was whispered to the teachers. What we found out was happening, though, and this happened in the case of the Parkland killer, he was sent to the Promise program for infractions in class. He had been, Max will walk through in great detail the number of infractions and the kinds of infractions, but he had been bringing weapons to school, making threats. He had Nazi symbols inscribed on his backpack and books and things like that, and these were all infractions. And so the school administrators simply didn't know what to do with him. They sent him to the Promise program. But it wasn't a program. Beyond the community relations campaign and the PowerPoints, they didn't even have a method of taking attendance. So when we were investigating the tragedy as a member of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Commission, we asked the district to provide the records on the Parkland killer's educational records. They had no record of him attending the Promise program because they weren't even taking attendance. I point that out to say that the left uses language to their advantage. You have to understand what they mean when they use a term. Don't take for granted that you understand the term. Make sure you understand what they mean when they use the term. The second thing is a lot of these programs are nothing more than window dressing. They're nothing more than public relations campaigns with great slogans that make most parents feel okay about the fact that they're implemented in their schools. And so they're meant to lull you to sleep to a certain extent. And for a lot of your friends that aren't as active, they sort of sound like a good idea. They hear it, maybe they hear it on the nightly news, and they think, yeah, that sounds fair, that sounds okay, and they let it go. So it's a challenge to try to enlist help and overturn these programs. And then, in reality, they don't work, and I want to spend a moment on that. So beyond the fact that they weren't even taking attendance and there was no program, there wasn't anything for the students that were in the Promise program, there was nothing for them to do except to go to an alternative school for a period of time, and they sat in what amounts to what we used to call study hall, basically. They sat in a classroom with a teacher at the front. They learned nothing. They did nothing. They literally just sat there. And of course, they weren't even taking attendance. So when a student would go to the Promise program, some of them would go. Those that didn't feel like going didn't go, and then they would just return to school, and there were no consequences for the behavior or actions. And I think we'll have an opportunity to do some Q&A after, but let me tell you what we've done in Florida. And I've had an opportunity, as Robin mentioned, to sit on the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Commission, and we investigated what happened in the tragedy. And contrary to the narrative that's sometimes put forward by the public, or in the public, what happened that day was a lot more complex, and it had been building over a number of years. What we learned about the Parkland killer was that he was first violent in kindergarten. And Max exposed some of this in his book, and that led to our investigation and some positive outcomes there, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But he first attacked another student in kindergarten, and that pattern repeated all throughout his educational career until after he graduated. There were no real consequences. Beyond the occasional suspension, beyond having to or supposedly attending the Promise program, there weren't real consequences for his actions. So he never learned that the kind of antisocial behavior that we see so often, you saw examples of this in the video, the antisocial behavior we're seeing more and more in our schools, there was no feedback to him. There was no feedback that what he was doing is wrong, and he certainly wasn't getting it at home. But that's a story for another time. The proponents of restorative justice argue that we have what's called a school-to-prison pipeline. Here's another one of those terms that you may hear, school-to-prison pipeline. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? Who wants a school-to-prison pipeline? No one that I know wants a school-to-prison pipeline. But what those advocates fail to mention is that the real tragedy of many of these restorative justice programs is that the first interaction some of these students have, and again, some of these students are committing violent crimes in our schools. They are not interacting with the juvenile justice system. They don't get the feedback loop until they become adults. And then it really matters, and then it really counts, and they do end up in prison. It's almost as if they've inverted what really happens. The real school-to-prison pipeline is when we don't have adequate consequences for antisocial behavior in our schools and in our classrooms. We don't teach kids that you can't behave that way, you can't pick a fight, you can't bring weapons to school, you can't threaten other students, you can't threaten or hit your teachers. If they don't learn that, if they're never taught that, if there are never consequences, then when they turn 18, we turn them loose on society, and what do we think is going to happen? They're going to end up in prison. They're going to end up in prison where the consequences are real. A good friend of mine, former and fellow commissioner, Sheriff Grady Judd, has said, why, in sort of questioning why these programs exist, why would we isolate these troubled kids from the one system that can hold them and their families and their parents accountable for their behavior, which is the juvenile justice system? So these restorative justice programs are meant to put a barrier, a layer in between the juvenile justice system and these kids. And he's saying, why would we do that? Because you can't hold them accountable at school, and their parents aren't holding them accountable. So the one system that could hold them accountable, we're isolating them from. It doesn't make any sense. So let me tell you what we've done in Florida, because there's some important things that I think we've done, and I want to make sure, and I'm happy to answer questions about this later, but we've done a few things. One is, we redefined what is a disciplinary issue, something the school can deal with, and what is a juvenile justice infraction. So we have clear language now in the state of Florida. So there's no room for ambiguity for enterprising school superintendents like Robert Runcie to come in and play cop. So that was the first thing we did, clear language. It's now clear to the districts what is a juvenile justice offense and what is just simply a disciplinary action that they have authority over. We've also made sure that we have law enforcement in every school in our district, and they are part of what's called a behavioral threat assessment and management team. Again, a topic for another day, but when threats are identified at a school, that behavioral threat assessment team, which includes law enforcement, can take action against that. And does that mean that a potential threat is going to go to a juvenile justice action? Absolutely not. The earlier we find out about the threat, the more possibilities for intervention we have. The goal is not to put kids into juvenile justice system. The goal is to figure out what's going on in their lives and bring either consequences if needed or other interventions that can put them on a different track. So we've done that. The other thing we did is in state law now, school districts are not allowed to run their own restorative justice programs that aren't linked with what we call in Florida the state's attorney's office, so the district attorney, as it were. I'm more familiar with the term district attorney than state's attorney, but that's essentially what it is in Florida. So every law enforcement agency and any school district that wants to participate in any kind of a juvenile justice or civil citation program has to be run through the state's attorney. Cannot just be a school district going rogue. And so that's another thing that you could do. The next thing that we've done in Florida is that we require school districts to report disciplinary events at their school. We used to do it at the end of the school year. They would report their total numbers, and we saw things that you absolutely wouldn't believe. So Miami-Dade County, I think this was in 2019, I think they had something like 4 fights is what they reported to the state. Now, who believes for a moment Miami-Dade County had 4 fights? That's a district bigger than Broward's, by the way. It's about almost, I think there's 350,000 students in that district. 4 fights, it didn't make any sense. So we said, okay, you're not going to report at the end of the year, you're going to report every month. And you're going to report to the Florida Department of Education, to our Office of Safe Schools, and we have a team now that analyzes the data that comes in every month, and we look at what's going on in those schools and in those districts, and we can engage with those districts now and say, what's going on? Why are fights up, 37% this month from last month? What's going on? Which schools now are the problem schools? And we can go and address those problems. But the important thing is to get the districts, by law, to report. And I will tell you, this was a 2-step process. So the first one was to get them to report on a monthly, get them to report accurately at the every month. The second thing is we had to have real consequences for superintendents and districts that didn't report their numbers, because they fought us over this. And so now, the State Board of Education can withhold the salary of school board members and superintendents that don't accurately report. And they're required to sign the document every month saying these are actual and factual numbers. And if we find out they aren't, we can withhold their salaries. And we haven't had to take that action since we've been able to do that. So those are the things that I would encourage parents to advocate for around the country. Clear language. What's disciplinary? What's in the realm of juvenile justice? Make sure those things are codified into law in your state. Make sure school districts can't go rogue. Make sure they have to participate with law enforcement. Ideally in a behavioral threat assessment team, but if you can't get that implemented, make sure that at least they're working with that juvenile justice or the state attorney or district attorney in your county. Make sure that program is part of that. Make sure that they are reporting their data on incidents of discipline and other criminal activity. Don't let them get away with not reporting. And last but not least, make sure that there's real teeth and that there are penalties for those that don't report. This has been a difficult journey. This is not one I asked for. I was perfectly happy building software. That was what I do for a living, and I was perfectly happy to continue to do that. But fighting for our kids is worth it. I've got two grandsons and 2 granddaughters on the way. My daughter-in-law is going to have twins here in the next month or so. A lot of what I'm doing now, my kids are grown. But every morning when I wake up and I see their faces, I realize that the decisions that I'm making, that I made as a parent, the decisions I'm making as a grandparent now, as a member of the State Board of Education, will have real impact on their lives. They're worth fighting for. They're worth doing everything they can. They're worth the battles, the spending time with the politicians. They're worth whatever it is you need to do to make sure that they're kept safe, because no matter what they learn at school, if they don't come home safely, it's all for naught. And I'll leave that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I think you got all of us parents. Max Eden is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education reform, specifically K through 12 and early childhood education. Before rejoining AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Mr. Eden is the co-author of Why Meadow Died: The People and Policies That Created the Parkland Shooter and Endanger America's Students. He is also the co-editor of the Every Student Succeeds Act, What It Means for Schools, Systems, and States. Mr. Eden has testified about school violence before Congress and about the school-to-prison pipeline before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and has been widely published on these issues, and we're so grateful to him for coming here tonight. Please welcome Max Eden.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. So I didn't come by this issue anywhere near as tragically as Ryan did, but I did kind of come to it somewhat personally, because my mom was a teacher in the Cleveland Public Schools, lovely woman, 5'4", blonde, 50-something. As long as she had the principal behind her, she could manage the class. But in 2013, 2014, a new principal came in, and this principal said, we're doing this discipline reform thing. We're going to try restorative justice. So I don't want to see a student unless there's been a fight. You will have to figure it out unless there's been a fight. If there's a fight, you can send it to me. My mom had taught 6th grade for about 15 years. Instantly, she couldn't, because the kids knew that the edge had changed, and the kids are kids. They'll go up to the edge, they'll challenge it, they'll see what they can get away with. So my mom, within 3 years, went from teaching 6th grade to 2nd grade to 1st grade to retiring and teaching in the suburbs. And when I started at my previous employer, the Manhattan Institute, as a expert in education policy, it's just literally my job to research and write and speak and listen about schools and what's going on in schools. This was something that I wanted to understand more of. Was this experience that my mom had a one-off thing? Was this a widespread phenomenon? Because I had heard in the years prior that there had been this Dear Colleague letter, which I'll circle back to, that there had been this broad initiative to fight the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. And the narrative behind that was pretty compelling as far as narratives go, right? There are these massive disparities in school discipline numbers, massive disparities in detentions and suspensions, expulsions and arrests by race and by disability. And we can see that students who get disciplined are more likely to drop out, and more likely, students who drop out are more likely to go to jail. So we need to do something about this. We need to make discipline kind of more equitable. We need to close these racial and ability gaps in discipline. And I saw across the country, it was not just the Cleveland Public Schools that picked this up, it was almost every school district you could look to. So when I started my role, I was wondering, well, I wonder what's actually happening here. And the first thing that I noticed were, of course, a bunch of articles saying, hey, we instituted restorative justice, we're instituting discipline reform, suspensions are way down, it's a massive success. But I thought this doesn't really tell you anything, because of course suspensions are down. The point is to make suspensions down. The question is what's happening in the classroom. And so I looked more into kind of local media, more into school surveys, and everywhere I looked, I found the same pattern in school and teacher surveys. I found a higher percentage of students say that kids are disrespecting each other, a higher percentage of students say that students don't respect adults, higher percentage of students say there's gang activity in big urban areas, lower percentage of students say they feel safe. And I was kind of taking this data to my colleagues across the aisle, and I was like, this, everywhere that I can find something that isn't an obviously biased news article, this looks like bad news to me. Can you please show me somewhere where this is working? And I would hear time and time again, oh, well, you should go to Broward County and see what they're doing there. It's great. And I thought, okay, maybe at some point I'll do that. About 5 days after the shooting, there was an article in the Washington Post saying that the Parkland shooter did not slip through the cracks because Broward County had implemented restorative justice. They were being proactive in discipline. They weren't just punishing kids. They were doing everything possible to help students across the district. And so this wasn't a case of a kid falling through the cracks. This was a case of there just wasn't anything more that the school district could have done. And A couple days later, there was another article featuring a whole bunch of students who basically said, we knew this was him while it was happening. We knew that he could do this. He brought bullets to school, he brought knives to school, he threatened to kill us, he threatened to rape our families. We saw something, we said something, and the administrators did nothing. And I thought, oh, well, Broward County, I wonder what's going on there. It became clear to me within weeks and then about a month or two that nobody was really going to ask the question of what had happened within the school, right? All the emphasis was on gun control. I don't really have a dog in that fight, but the media had already chalked up the idea that something could have gone wrong at the school as being a false narrative spun by right-wing provocateurs. So I traveled down there to try to ask students, teachers, family members questions. I ended up meeting Andrew Pollack, I ended up meeting Ryan Petty, and I ended up conducting an investigation about what happened there. And so I'll tell you some of what I found there and how it relates to what's probably going on in Williamson County and counties around here. So as Ryan said, around 2013, 2014, the Broward County School District implemented the Promise program, which was an explicit effort to lower in-school arrests. So Ryan talked about the fact that, despite great fanfare, the program had absolutely no curriculum. Despite great fanfare, the students just kind of sat there in study hall. What he didn't quite say is how it was such a success in lowering arrests. It succeeded in lowering arrests by basically telling school resource officers, kids get 3 free misdemeanors every year before you have the option of arresting them. And actually, behind closed doors, if there are felonies on the table, depending on the nature of the felony, you should also not arrest them for that too. So that's a pretty easy way to reduce arrests, which keeps kids out of the accountability system, keeps kids away from the help that they need in many cases. And as Ryan had mentioned, at first, the superintendent denied it. It turned out there wasn't even reasonable paperwork that had been done on it. But the more I talked to students and teachers across the district, the more I reviewed the actual records of the student himself, the more I realized that the Promise program was only one part of the story of how kind of discipline reform, restorative justice had intersected with this child's life. Because this kid could not have given any more indication of who he was and what he wanted to do. I mean, he had to be restrained, physically restrained by a leash on his way to pre-K. He was kicked out of, I think, 2 pre-Ks before he finally landed the public one. He was in a separate classroom for grades K through 5 for students with a disability that's called emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, right? Because some kids who have disabilities are deaf, they're blind, they're dyslexic, they have autism. Some kids are labeled with a disability because they simply cannot behave. He was one such student. And while he was with a group of 5 or 10 other students in a separate closed classroom, he did okay. His disciplinary records in K through 5 are not crazy. When he gets to middle school and he's put into a normal classroom, that's where his discipline records go absolutely insane. This is before the Promise program is implemented. This is before the general effort to reduce suspensions and expulsions. And he is getting suspended. He got suspended for literally half of his 7th grade year. He spent basically every other day out of school in suspension. So in 7th grade, the problem wasn't that he wasn't getting disciplined. In 7th grade, the problem was that the school was doing everything it could to make it hard to send a student with an extreme emotional disturbance to a private or a close-knit setting with specialists that could handle a kid like him. So I'd like to just kind of read a few things that the teachers recorded about him at the time, because it gives you a flavor of kind of a month in the life of the student. This is from one teacher's log from September to October of his 7th grade year. Nick returned from after being in suspension. After discussing and lecturing about the Civil War, he became fixated in the death and assassination of Lincoln. He asked inappropriate questions, such as making shooting actions with his pencil. Some questions he asked were, what did it sound like when Lincoln was shot? Was there blood everywhere? After the war, what did they do with all the bodies? Did people eat them? 5 days later, when we began to read the Odyssey, he paid partial attention until we came to the gruesome scene where a giant eats Odysseus' crew members. Only then was he interested in the lesson and got my 100% attention. He would frequently make sexually explicit gestures and references, which I won't read out loud. On September 27th, another student informed the teacher that after he was escorted out of class, the student asked him, "How am I still at this school?" Right? So this kid understands that he doesn't belong there. He does not understand why he's still there. 4 days later, when talking about a figurative language and onomatopoeias, he shouted, "Like a gun shooting, he will find any excuse to bring up shooting guns or violence." He got frustrated, said, "I hate security, I hope they die." Then he stated, "F you, I called security." Around the end of the month, the assistant principal came in. As soon as the assistant principal left, the student shouted, "Yes, I can talk now." He continued to be disruptive. The teacher said, "I know you can behave. I have seen you. You're a good kid." And he shouted, "I'm a bad kid. I want to kill." So it took about 1.5 years of this level of behavior to put a student like this into a small school with a high teacher-to-student ratio, where he had, daily access to a therapist, daily access to a school psychiatrist, and he did pretty well there, as far as we can tell. Hard adjusting period, but eventually his discipline record became normal. The teachers marked some progress. Yes, he did tell his school psychiatrist that he dreamed of killing people and being covered in blood, but because he was doing a little bit better, they figured time to send him back into the traditional high school, because we want to do everything we can to keep students from being excluded, right? When he gets back to Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, now the discipline reform policies are in place, right? They weren't in place when he was in middle school, they were in place while he was in high school. And it's a mystery to me at first, because as I'm talking to students, I'm hearing, he would jump out from behind pillars and scream at you. He brought a dead bird to school and put it on a lunch bag in front of me. He brought bullets to school and would show them off. He brought knives to school. He would threaten to kill us. He would attack kids and beat people up. But I couldn't find basically anything in his disciplinary record to reflect this. He got suspended partially internally for 3 times while he was in high school, despite the school security guards saying to the police later, "Oh yeah, we knew him, we saw him. Every time you saw him around, you were like, oh, send him to the office, send him to the office. We always had our eye on him." But there was no record of this whatsoever. In fact, the one time that there was a record, when he was disciplined for walking around with a swastika behind his back, and also the words "I hate ends" written on his backpack, he was disciplined that day. It turns out that was the day that his normal assistant principal was off campus. So that kind of tells you something about how schools respond to this pressure to not discipline students. It's very easy to not discipline a student. You just either discipline them and don't record it, or you don't discipline them at all. And both of these things happened in his case, right? If he had been suspended every other day in high school like he had been in middle school, maybe he could have been sent back to that specialized school where he really needed to be. But he wasn't. So there was no way they could make a case that this is a kid who doesn't belong in a public high school. They ended up waiting till, kind of as far as they can wait, and they pushed him out the back door in what was a very kind of administratively underhanded way to do it. It helped foster a massive grudge that he held against the school. He eventually reapproached the school and said, "I want to come back. I'll even go to the specialized school." They did not respond to that. And he came back and did what he did that day. I'm forgetting one kind of key drama moment. There was one point where it was very clear that he should have been arrested by, I think, any reasonable, normal human judgment, right? He had started throwing objects at a student, a black student. He shouted, "I hate you," called the student an N-word, went up and attacked the student. This was recorded at the time, because kids always have their cell phones out, and I talked to a young woman who said that at this point she and her friends were like, enough is enough, we have to tell them everything we know about him. So they went to the office, and they said all the things that I've been saying to you to the assistant principal. They wrote down statements according to this young woman and handed them in writing to the assistant principal. The assistant principal asked to review records of this video, and then asked the students to delete the video. And then he was given a 2-day internal suspension. The kid he was attacked was given a 1-day external suspension, right? So he could have been arrested in school. He should have been arrested in school. He should have been disciplined just in a normal process for normal misbehavior that could have ended up helping him, but he wasn't. And The reason why this story matters for you guys and for parents across the country is, as Robin had mentioned, and as Ryan had mentioned, Broward County became kind of the model for the nation on school discipline. I had mentioned that there was this Dear Colleague letter earlier. It took me years to figure out what this Dear Colleague letter actually was, right? There's civil rights enforcement, so it used to be the case that, you know, if a black student and a white student both swore at a teacher and the black student got a suspension, the white student got a detention, and they were basically the same in all other regards, that's racially discriminatory treatment, and that needs to be rectified. And the federal government has the power to come in and say, we'll take away all of your money unless you remedy the situation because you have discriminated against the student. They changed the standard with this Dear Colleague letter from disparate treatment to disparate impact. So the simplest way to describe that is if 2 black students and 1 white student all swore at a teacher and they were all suspended the same, it may or may not be a civil rights violation depending on the background racial composition of the school district. School districts that had higher rates of discipline for African American students or students with disability, which frankly most school districts have. It's an unfortunate fact. There are other background factors that go into it. Poverty, single parent households, general neighborhoods, like states of neighborhood, all these things affect students. They are not equally distributed amongst children in America. When it comes to students with disabilities, the one disability category that's over-disciplined is the emotionally behaviorally disturbed category. So school districts were kind of given notice that the federal government might investigate you and might take away all of your money simply based on your overall numbers of school discipline. And once you're under investigation, the only way that these investigations could end is if you agreed to adopt our preferred discipline policies, if you agreed to lower suspensions, lower arrests, implement restorative justice, kind of do the Broward County model, not to the extreme of the Promise program and, 3 free misdemeanors a year, not necessarily, but absolutely lower your rates of discipline, lower your arrests, lower your suspensions, try to even them out by race or else. And so naturally, principals will react to this, especially because it very quickly became not just a question of administrative coercion, but a question of social justice, as Ryan was indicating, right? We need to fix the school to prison pipeline. We know that there are unequitable disparities and we can address them. So it just became the thing to do if you're a school administrator or a superintendent. You demonstrated how good you were by how low you could get your discipline rates, by how low you could get your discipline disparities. And as study after study that has since come out has confirmed, what my mom experienced was par for the course. There have been kind of 3 studies of the effects of this on academics. All 3 are dramatically negative. In Philadelphia, they lowered percentage proficiency by 3 and 7% in reading and math. Truancy skyrocketed by 25 percentage points, right? Not percent, not like from 8 to 12, but percentage points from about 20 to 45. In LA, in San Francisco, in San Diego, and all these school districts that had suspension bans, math scores went down by almost a standard deviation. Everywhere I could find student and teacher surveys, you would find teachers saying things like this. We were told that referrals would not require suspension unless there was blood. I would like to see a consequence for bad behavior of some kind, such as when a male student pulled out his and showed it to another girl student and admitted he did so and nothing was done. That was in Oklahoma City. In Buffalo, teachers said students are threatening teachers with violence and in many cases physically attacking teachers with little to no consequence. Another teacher said, a student said he would shoot and kill me. 3 students heard the threat as shoot and kill, but the administration believed the perpetrator who claimed he was going to prank me with a slingshot. Administration said since he didn't specifically use the word gun, it was not as serious of a threat as I thought. These policies are basically everywhere at this point, to some degree, right? The extreme of 3 free misdemeanors a year, I can't say whether or not that's in place in Williamson County, but I would bet sight unseen that school administrators are marking their success by how low they can get school discipline, that teachers aren't being supported, that there is unnecessary disruption, unnecessary fights that are occurring, because normal kids will absolutely find the limit and push to the limit. That's just what normal kids do. And unfortunately, there are also abnormal kids. There was just a couple of weeks ago a 6-year-old in Virginia who shot his teacher. And as soon as the Washington Post story came out on that, you heard teacher after teacher saying, they don't support us on discipline. This kid was threatening me every day. He barricaded us all in the classroom. We tried calling security all the time. They ended up having this kid's parents come to school to be with him every day. The first day his mom didn't come to school with him was the day he shot his teacher. Same story in Oxford, Michigan, very similar story, a kid with a long record, disciplinary neglect. Teachers had heard that there was a gun in his bag. They didn't search his bag. He went to the bathroom, took it out, and shot students in that school. So both kind of the normal day-to-day misbehavior side and the extreme instances are profoundly exacerbated by this effort to fight the school-to-prison pipeline, because it turns out that the easiest way to get your discipline numbers lower, the easiest way to reduce suspensions, to reduce arrests, is to just not do it. And if you can be rewarded for not doing it, then you won't do it, right? I mean, you're a principal, you have power over teachers. The teachers can't really complain around you because then they'll get in trouble with you. And so that's what's going to happen. So Ryan had given some great suggestions kind of on the more serious, the arrest side, the law enforcement side. To all the parents here, I would just say talk to the teachers directly. You know, talk to the students, and you may or may not necessarily ask them what restorative justice is. I suppose I should actually explain what it is. I'll do that in a second. But you know, don't ask them, hey, is our school doing restorative justice? But ask them, hey, do you feel supported by your administrators? Do they back you up when there are problems in the classroom? And if the answer is no, then you have to keep on pushing at that. If the answer is yes, then great. But I would bet more often than not the answer is no. And then to the extent that you can, go to the school board members, try to go over the school administrators' heads to say, we're hearing about all these fights. Ask them to write anonymous letters, ask the students what's going on, and of course, ask if there's that one student who everybody knows shouldn't be there. Because there might be. If you would ask students at Marjory, Stoneman, Douglas, they all would have said the name of the shooter at that time. If you'd asked students in Virginia or in Oxford, Michigan, they both would have said those students. So you have to talk to your teachers, talk to your children, and ask. I suppose as a coda, I should explain what restorative justice is supposed to be, right? Robin mentioned that it came from the criminal justice system. The idea within the criminal justice system was actually good, right? At the end of a prison term, as part of the rehabilitation process, encourage the prisoner to try to approach the person that he had wronged and make amends, or show that he understood that he did something wrong, or speak to them in some way. When this was imported into K-12 schools, it was imported as a replacement for traditional discipline, right? So instead of punishing a kid who punches another kid, let's all sit down in a circle and let's talk about it. And let's figure out the roots of your trauma, why you decided to behave this way, how it affected the other students. It sounds very nice in theory, kind of, although it can be a total torment in practice sometimes, right? You take a kid who's picking on another kid and you put him in a setting where he will make further fun of the kid and get away with it and know it. It can be a tormenting procedure, but mostly it doesn't actually happen because teachers don't have time for this, administrators don't have time for this. Mostly restorative justice is something that school officials say to pat themselves on the back about how great they are in school discipline because look, a number that we can manipulate has gone down. And what's the worst that can happen? And even when the worst case happens, there's no guarantee that school administrators will be held accountable. I mean, Ryan and Andrew Pollack had to really move mountains to expose what happened, to get the facts out, to get accountability for school officials. Frankly, if there had been a different group of parents affected, I don't know that any of this would have come to light. I don't know that the superintendent would have ever been indicted for perjury by a grand jury. The school board members would have been kicked out by Ron DeSantis. I don't know that we would have ever known the story. So there's really no accountability for school administrators, school district administrators, principals, when it comes to discipline, except for what they hear from parents. And parents can't rely on what they hear from administrators. You have to talk to your you have to talk to your teachers, and you have to talk to your students. So with that, I think Ryan and I would be happy to take some questions. Yeah. Yeah. Is that? Oh, yes, of course. I heard it. Barely, but I heard it. Yeah, so the question, the woman asked that in addition to what had gone on in the school, she'd also heard that the police had been heavily involved in a strange way with the shooter as well. And that is also true. It was not just within the school that he was behaving this way, he was also behaving this way within the home. His mother was frankly terrified of him. And the cops were called to his house 40-something times?
42, I think was.
42 times. But also in the community at this time, the sheriff had basically said, we judge our success not by how many kids we put in jail, but by how many kids we keep out of jail. So, you know, this was a success story outside of the school district as well, in the logic of people who think this way about law and order.
The sheriff at the time, who was later removed by the governor, and the Senate backed up that removal. So in Florida, any constitutionally elected officer can be removed. In Florida, we elect our sheriffs. The governor has the ability to remove him, so we asked Governor DeSantis to remove the sheriff from office for this. What he did was abdicate his responsibility as the chief law enforcement officer of the county to an unelected, appointed superintendent who basically was the new sheriff in town when it came to juvenile justice and juvenile sanctions and penalties. And so he just basically said, school district, you take care of it. We're gonna stop arresting juveniles. And I think, Max, it was 53 or 57% reduction in the next year of juvenile arrests. And they walked around and say, and this is what restorative justice proponents will say, look at our numbers. Juvenile arrests are down 57%. Well, of course they are, because they do what Max described. They just stop interacting with juveniles. They stop arresting them. And I just want to add one thing to what Max said. It was 3 misdemeanors, but they could be they had to be 3 of the same type of misdemeanor for it to have an impact. So if you, I'm making this up, if you hit a student, that was one type of misdemeanor. If you hit a teacher, that was different. And if you vandalized the school, that was yet a third. So you had to have 3 of a kind to have any interaction with the juvenile justice system in Broward County.
We'll get the mic to you in 1 sec.
Hi there, by the way, thank you so much for all your input. New data for me. I'd like to get your feedback. I did a lot of research on the Parkland shooter a long time ago and discovered that he had been placed on an in and out of treatment with a psychiatrist and on multiple drugs, and even complained about the psychiatric drugs he was on, making him violent. I'm curious because Florida still has an involuntary detainment of children, and majority of the children that get detained are from schools. So, for example, I had an incident happen in my school here in Franklin in Williamson County where my daughter, she's not violent, but she has had, basically, she's having a hard time with math. The teacher then goes, hey, maybe we should get her assessed for ADHD or ADD. And that's a whole other can of worms, which then they get special funding, et cetera. And then you get categorized as special needs, then that's also plays on your point of, okay, well now you're special needs, we gotta treat her with kid gloves and our funding. So I'm just curious if there was also a part of your guys' work or your research that delved into the connection of psychiatric treatment and psych drugs for those children and the shooter, because I see it. I mean, I just looked real quick to confirm my data, but he had been on medications since he was 6 years of age on psychiatric meds. So I'm just curious, since those all have black box warnings, if you guys have done any research on that.
Yeah, I didn't look anywhere near as closely into the psychiatric side of things because that's not my area of expertise, but there are a couple points that are worth bringing up, I think. One is that the public mental health system also failed him. They were given at least 3 distinct opportunities where it wasn't the police called, but it was the mental health authorities called, and they could have involuntarily committed him for observation, which could have started a process that would have potentially flagged him as unfit to own a gun, including instances where he was clearly threatening to kill people, where he had drawn pictures of killing people, and where he was talking about how he can't wait to turn 18 so he can buy a gun. And at no point in the 3 times that the mental health authorities were there to assess him did they actually follow through with anything, and it's kind of par for the course. Very lenient on the interventions in mental health from like a state side, whereas on the other hand, from a drug side, the only thing I can say, the one thing that I recall is Andrew Pollack mentioning to me at one point that, one of the drugs that he was on just last year got a black box warning for increasing homicidal ideation. I don't remember which drug it was, but there was at least one thing that he had been on for quite some time that when he was put on it, that warning wasn't there. Eventually that warning was there, and I think I share your overall concern about the unknown side effects of a lot of these psychiatric medications, because did it play a decisive role? I can't say. But was he on things that have been medically proven to make people with a predisposition to homicide want to commit homicide? Yes.
The other thing I would add, we went into closed session and went through his complete medical history, so I have to be careful about what I'm allowed to disclose and what I'm not still. I'm not sure I understand my non-disclosure covenant in this regard, but what I will say is this. There was an interplay between the public mental health provider there that was involved with the killer and his family and prescribing some of the medications. There was a private psychiatrist that was also involved. And then there was Mom. And Mom was very good at making excuses for the behavior. And so attempts to manage his outbursts and some of the things we learned that are now public. I mean, he assaulted his mother on multiple occasions, kicked her teeth in, shot her with a pellet gun, killed animals in the neighborhood. I mean, it was well known, right? These are some of the reasons there were 42 visits to the home by law enforcement. There were more visits. There isn't I don't think there's a kid on the planet that had more mental health services provided than the Parkland killer. They were there almost every day. The problem that you'll find in the mental health, and I'm going outside of the educational realm here for just a moment, and I'll just, bear with me. The problem is that over there, they're not really good at case management and treating towards an outcome. And so what they do is these kids, they just languish. They get paid to come out and visit. So there's no incentive, financial or otherwise, for them to treat and hope that the patient improves. They get more funding the more visits and the more they do. And so they're not managing the cases. They're not managing to a positive outcome. And we saw what happened here. And then, of course, Mom would make excuses. Mom would say, well, he didn't mean to kick me, or he was just mad because I didn't let him play violent video games, those kinds of things. And so she was an advocate for him, but in a perverse way.
Is there any type of numbers in regards of single-parent families where these kids are going into Restorative Justice or dual-parent families, anything like that? I would just like to say that this kid, this one parent, one mom,
right.
was dead by the system. Is there any numbers of where two parents, one parent live?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of not anecdotally, it tends to be the case more often than not. I think in absolute terms, there aren't really enough numbers for anybody to have run a study on it when it comes to students who commit these kind of acts. In general, it's very well established that kids from one-parent households will be suspended, which means they misbehave, at twice the rate of kids from two-parent households. That's almost the entirety of the racial gap in suspensions can be attributed to the gap in family.
As a Christian, I've seen, and I'm probably getting to be one of the older people in this room, I've seen quite a change in society in how even parents raise their children in the home. And a lot of those problems that are happening in the schools are because parents are not really being trained about what the Bible says on child discipline and child chastisement. Those are two different things. And, you don't, biblically, children are not to talk back to parents. And there is a switch. And that is to be used to bring children under control. And parents need to be in authority in their own home and respect that authority, because if they don't, you're going to end up with children like we're seeing today. There's a good book, and I just want to put a plug in for this book, not only the Bible, but Richard Fugate has taken all the scriptures from the Bible, has put them together to help parents. It's called What the Bible Says About Child Training. That is the most comprehensive book by a preacher that I have seen, and it's outstanding. I would recommend it for any parent to read it.
Yeah. I guess my comment would be, I love that parents are getting re-engaged with the educational system. So I think it's, for too long, I think parents like me sort of, you like I said it when I presented, we bought in a good district, we bought in a good neighborhood, and we assumed everything was sort of on autopilot. And so to see parents and Moms for Liberty engaging again to make sure our schools are accountable to parents and families is wonderful. That tells me that those kids have a good home life and a good structure at home, which is fundamental. I'll tell you my own experience. I was a bit of a smart aleck in high school, in elementary school, and that led to high school and some other things. But I will tell you that I knew when I got in trouble at school, when I got home, I was in twice as much trouble, at a minimum. I knew that my parents would go to bat for me because they loved me, and if the school had done something wrong or a teacher had done something wrong, they were willing to go there and tell that teacher or that principal or that administrator that they were doing something wrong, but they were also willing to acknowledge that I wasn't an angel all the time, and that when I deserved discipline, I certainly got it. And so I got that message loud and clear. We need that again, I think, in our schools. And there's some structural things. I'm thinking this behavioral thing. Could you elaborate on that a little bit about sort of the students that have the behavioral disability and the inability of schools to deal with that?
I'll go in a slightly different direction than that. I think it's worth, kind of to your broader point, a further emphasis on the fact that behind the words restorative justice, as Ryan had said, it really is a fundamentally different, and I'm a Jew, so I can't speak to it that deeply, but in my opinion, an anti-Christian worldview of human nature that's driving this kind of shift within schools, right? Because it deems all student misbehavior to be a product of trauma or oppression, right? There's an assumption that the child is entirely innocent and only sinned against, and any sin committed by the child is a product of adults around him who are doing bad things to him. There's no sense of, there's no even sense of misbehavior as status seeking, right? I mean, a lot of times kids will misbehave just because it'll make them look good to their peers. The other kid will laugh about it. A lot of times they misbehave, frankly, because there's something, dark in all of our hearts that if it's unchecked will come out and affect others. But the schools that were under investigation by the Department of Education for these disciplinary disparities, part of the resolution agreements that they were asked to come to, part of what they were asked to do to not have their federal funds taken away, was to actually do the exact opposite of what Ryan, explained was done with him, was to actually train parents to second guess the disciplinary judgments of their teachers, right? So we have kind of, I think, from both like the high and the low, so to speak, from kind of spoiled, entitled parents and really deeply broken homes, a sense of defensiveness over their kids' behavior rather than a sense of reinforcement. And we had from the federal government a sense that schools should actually cultivate, parental insubordination rather than be on the same team with the parents about norms and expectations and just basic decorum.
So tell me, Ryan, if you could tell a parent who has a child that's come home and said, my peer is losing it, my peer has said these things, we have done all this dangerous behavior, I've told our teachers, I've gone to an administrator, what does that parent do? And if the parent goes to the school, kind of the process that has happened here is the administration won't discuss another student with, a different family and so on. There's no good follow-up to find out, okay, well, what has happened? And that's happening here in Williamson County. There are behavior issues, and there are parents that have kids coming home saying, my peer is going to go postal when his girlfriend breaks up with him. He has all of these dangerous behaviors. Last year, he had a kill list or a this or a that, and he's still at school every day, and he says all these things, and no one does anything about it. So what does that parent do? What would you do or tell that parent to do?
Yeah, some of this goes to, had I known, what would I have done differently?
Yes.
So I think Max gave fantastic advice earlier. And when you read the book, you understand the teachers. I would go talk to your child's teachers, and I would get a grounding as to whether or not what you're hearing from your kids is in line with what the teachers are telling you. Now, they can't share names, and they'll talk about privacy and all the things that you mentioned, but go talk to the teachers and try to get that understanding from them. You can ask for a parent-teacher conference and bring up the topic of, hey, my kids are telling me that these threats are being made. Are you seeing this? And I would try to validate with the teachers. Once you do that, then you can take further action. But I think the first thing to do is to talk to the teachers.
Is there some type of system in place where all these different agencies are communicating and red flagging and keeping all the information coming from the mental health side, the school side, the police, where it all comes together in one place and is kept so the kid can be red flagged ahead of time? I was an executive director for a medical group years ago, and we had an opioid crisis in our county. And we came together and created a task force to make doctors, pharmacies, et cetera, accountable, because a patient could go around to different doctors, different pharmacies. Nobody was communicating, but now they could red flag doctors for overprescribing it. Is there something in place where they create a one spot where everybody has to report to so it doesn't go all over the place in different?
Yeah, I mean, if I rephrase your question, are different government agencies able to communicate and work well with each other? And the answer,
No.
the quick answer is no.
No.
So the way to solve that is, I mentioned this, and this is a whole nother topic, but behavioral threat assessment and management is the best mechanism I'm aware of to coordinate all of those stakeholders, not to use a term of the left, but the stakeholders that are responsible for education, the mental health and welfare of the child, law enforcement, teachers. Everybody comes together in this behavioral threat assessment team, and they have those conversations. And that's the only mechanism that I'm aware of that allows for that. Typically, school districts and law enforcement do this to each other. That's the general posture, and certainly on the mental health side. And they do it for reasons that you'll hear about. It's usually federal law that was probably well-intentioned at some point. You'll hear things like FERPA. That's the Federal Educational Privacy Rights legislation. We all heard of HIPAA, right? Every time you go to the doctor, you have to sign a HIPAA form, right? That's your healthcare privacy. Those federal laws scare local government agencies and state government agencies into having this posture of not talking or working with each other. The only way to break that down, to break those silos down, is for them to come together. The mechanism to do that is called behavioral threat assessment and management. That's something we've implemented in the state of Florida. For those that are curious, it's how the Secret Service protects the president. It's the same model, and it's just applied to school safety, and it works incredibly well, but it requires legislative action, really, to put it into place. We have behavioral threat assessment teams in every school in Florida. They're required by law to share information. They still hate sharing information, but they're forced to do it. Is it perfect? No, but it's the only mechanism I'm aware of where that kind of information gets shared. So if a kid is receiving mental health services from the community provider because he's hurting animals in the neighborhood, and law enforcement went there and a teacher heard him make a threat, they get together and they have that conversation. And then they work on interventions, whatever that is, up into and including juvenile justice sanctions, right, depending on the threat. Hopefully I answered your question. That's a really hard thing to solve.
I'm beginning to see a trend here. You've got the SEL, then it translates into restorative justice. Now then, you've got they want to have a mental health clinics in every school that's going to be staffed by the American School Counselors Association school members who want to remove the information from the parents. So as a school board member, I see all this happening. So now if they bring it before the board, I say, I'm not for this. Now I'm going to be the bad guy because I don't care for little Johnny or little Susie's mental, emotional issues. What are we as school board members, how can we address this to be showing that we do care even though we're perceived as we don't care?
No, it's hard, right? Yeah, no, it's a benefit to only have to write about this stuff and not actually have to do it. I don't really envy your position because it all does come together sounding so nice, and the other side has really made a monopoly on this whole notion of empathy, which frankly wasn't even a moral term 30 years ago. It's kind of strange to think how dramatically things can shift, but that wasn't even a word in our lexicon a few decades ago. I think you just have to address it bit by bit. You know, these are my concerns with the school counselors based on what the association is saying. This is my concern about SEL based on all of this. I think the entire paradigm is off. I do care, I care deeply, but I think that this is misguided. And I don't think they're really going to ever hear anything other than, I think you're misguided. I don't think they're ever going to internalize anything other than that. So it's probably the most that you can say. There really is no kind of alternative model that's waiting in the wings, and then, you know, if we can just get 6, 7 school board members and a board, we can shove all this out and get this new great thing in, because one side has been working at this, you know, the question of raising children for decades in great concert, and the other side has been mostly on its heels. Good.
So I got sworn in on a Tuesday, got sworn at on Wednesday.
So I sit on the Florida State Board of Education, and we're dealing with a number of these topics at a state level. So sometimes they're not quite as personal, and maybe we don't get yelled at as much. But you gotta, Max is right. You have to be willing to take the arrows because they're coming. And you are seeing a definite pattern. There is a connection between social justice, restorative justice, SEL, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ESG, right, in the corporate world. Those are all connected. And the challenge, the reason it's sometimes this is difficult to answer the question is because Max is absolutely right. We don't have alternatives to all of those things because we don't, generally speaking, think those things are good or that they need to have alternatives. We actually think that's not the role of government. That's the role of parents or the role of families, churches, community organizations that are not part of the government. So we don't have alternatives necessarily. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. It's really important that you understand the term that the left is using and what they mean by it. Not what you think they mean by it, but what they actually mean. And so when you look at, if I can toot our horn for just a little bit, watch what we're doing in Florida. We are removing diversity, equity, and inclusion from our colleges and universities. We are standing against social emotional learning and those kinds of programs in our schools. We are going through page by page and book by book through the curriculum that's in our schools. We are forcing schools to make lists of the books that are in the library, and we went as far as to say you also have to make lists of the books that are in the classroom, because that's where they were moving the books. Keep in mind, in your role as a school board member, parents have a God-given responsibility, a sacred obligation to those children. And they need to never be excluded from the information that you have as a school district. Parents need to be involved, and you can fight for policies, whatever you want to call them. Fight for policies that include parents in their kids' education. Don't let them don't let them hide anything from parents.
Max, have you reached any conclusions based upon your research and analysis as to what can be done to reduce or eliminate the plague of school shootings across the country?
I think there are two kind of policy points worth hitting, right? One is that you have to police the small stuff, because the entire, per the shooter's case, if he had been suspended for jumping out from behind pillars at other students and screaming at them, you can actually tell a plausible story as to how that suspension ends with enough information being sent to the school district central office to let him get to where he needs to be, right? We have institutions that are supposed to be sensitive to students in a lot of ways, and I don't mean sensitive in a purely, heart-throbbing way, but sensitive to what's actually going on with their behaviors and responsive to their behaviors. So one step is that those behaviors just have to be recorded every single time. If you don't sweat the small stuff, you open up your institutions to the larger things. And the second is what Ryan had mentioned, which I will just echo, maybe hand it back to him because he's actually far more expert than I, but the behavioral threat assessments are probably the best single tool that we have, and that is absolutely the kind of thing that a school board member could look to and decide to implement, that a state legislator could decide to make into a statewide policy, that a governor could champion, because once the behavior gets to the higher levels where people should be talking, then they absolutely must be talking, or else these things will happen.
Yeah, a little known fact about these school attacks, 90% of these attackers communicated their intentions prior to the attack. So our best chance of stopping them is to take action when we get that information. That's why these behavioral threat assessment teams are so important, because somebody knows that this attack is going to happen. It's either being posted on social, friends are being told, threats are being made at home, or threats are being made in the classroom, and we can stop these. Now, there's a certain percentage that aren't communicating. Those are a little bit harder to solve, but sometimes we still get what's called leakage or information about these attacks through other means, but 90% of these attacks could be stopped if we just took action. The sad thing about, and Max lays it out here in the book, the sad fact is my daughter is not here today because there was no action taken. The warning signs were there. this killer, we called him the best kept secret in Parkland. Everybody knew he could be the next school shooter. Nobody acted on it. And so you've got to force action. I think having these behavioral threat assessment teams is vital because it doesn't allow one agency or one group to hold information in a silo and not share it with somebody that can take action. Hopefully, in your case, law enforcement will take action. Unfortunately, they didn't take action in Broward County for the political reasons that Max and I talked about before. But that's our chance to stop these things. Secret Service has been doing it for years, threats against our elected officials like the president.
How can we in Williamson County get a copy of the policies and the procedures that you are describing that are working in Florida so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel and we can give them to our legislators?
Wonderful. I'd be happy to put that list together, but a lot of it's on the Florida Department of Education website. If you look at the Office of Safe Schools, we publish everything. The Marjory Stoneman Douglas Commission also publishes, we've published our findings, we've published a list, like here are the 5 free and easy things every school district could do to improve school safety and security. Just last Friday, we approved an active shooter policy template for any law enforcement agency in the country that doesn't have one. Broward County had a policy that was that allowed the officer discretion as to whether or not they went in when there was a school attack. If you can believe that, and if those of you that saw the video of what happened, the law enforcement response that day, the school resource deputy stood behind a pillar for 48 minutes while kids were being killed in a classroom and in that school building. You saw what happened in Uvalde. Those policies are unacceptable, so the Stoneman Douglas Commission, we put out a policy, any law enforcement agency can adopt it, but it tells law enforcement, you will go in. You will go in and address the threat. You will stop the threat immediately. And so I would commend that too. I will work with Robin and Moms for Liberty to put that list together, and we'll get that published.
I don't really have a question per se. First, thank you so much for being here. It was kind of in response to a question that was asked earlier, though. In my own story, I actually didn't dawn on me till we were here that I think this type of thing has actually been here much longer than I thought it had been. About 6 years ago, my son had a child put a tetherball rope around his neck on the playground. And I investigated, I spoke to him, I gave it a couple days thinking he was being overly dramatic. I finally talked to a kid that had come over to help him and found out his story was the same as my son's. We went in to talk to the principal. The principal did absolutely nothing. And hearing all of this is bringing it back to thinking it's actually been here very long. And I couldn't get anywhere with our principal, so I said, that's fine, I'll go to our school board. I couldn't get anywhere with our school board, so I would encourage any of you that are interested in helping us kind of get this stuff out of here and go back to some common sense practices to get involved. I ran for school board in our county, just was elected in September because I figured if I can't fix it that way, I'm gonna get on the inside and see how I can fix it that way. I think we're seeing a lot of parents, if you haven't had an experience like that, and I was guilty of this prior to this incident, we just don't know. Like you said, you kind of are on autopilot thinking everything is fine because nothing's happening specifically to your child. But there are tons of stories out there like mine that people are just completely unaware of, that I think it's gonna take the parents really getting together, talk to people when you have experiences, try to get groups together and really just get involved. But thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you.
You just touched on it, but my question was about law enforcement and why their basically lack of response. And are we seeing that in a lot of other states? Because it sounds like you guys are addressing it, but I just wanted a little more information on that.
I think we've seen horrific responses in some cases by law enforcement, and in others it's been excellent. It starts with good leadership. So whoever's a chief law enforcement officer in your city or your county, make sure they're a good person, they understand their role and their responsibility. Second, good policies. They need to have an active shooter policy for the school, and that needs to include the responsibility for those deputies and those officers to go in and stop the threat immediately. You don't wait for backup. We learned this at Columbine. You don't wait for backup. They go in and they address the threat immediately. And then the third thing is make sure that they aren't participating in any of these restorative justice programs that we talked about. Make sure that there may be something called a civil citation program. Those are generally, they have some accountability with them, but don't allow the school district to, on its own, decide what's juvenile criminal activity and discipline. Don't let them do that.
Yeah, just to make a little bit more explicit, one of the things that Ryan had said, the former Broward sheriff had actually changed the policy about how you handle school shootings from the deputy shall enter to the deputy may enter, right? So the deputy who was hiding behind a wall for 48 minutes was probably not doing it because that was the policy per se, but it was entirely consistent with the policy. He wasn't out of line, out of order in any way, shape, or form. And ultimately, what happened that day was the other Broward sheriff officers, he was not the only one to stand around outside just biding his time. Several other Broward sheriff's officer deputies came to the scene, took up a perimeter, waited behind their cars, and it was ultimately the Coral Springs Police Department, which had trained repeatedly, that went straight in. So it would be worth asking, your local law enforcement, what actually is our active shooter policy, and what are you doing to train? And, fight them a little bit on that if you need to, or compliment them on that if you can.
This here will be our very last question of the evening.
Good evening. Thank you. I, like these ladies, am on a local school board, and one of the things that we're dealing with is violent children that are under the auspices of IDEA, 504, ESSA. I know that you wrote a book on ESSA. Could you, we're having a difficult time dealing with these children because of all the regulations. If you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. My best answer is to just keep on asking your school administrator, how do you actually know that, or why do you think that's actually the case? Because a lot of the times it's just an excuse. Like, as somebody who's actually read the federal bill, read IDEA, these things don't actually do in writing what they end up doing in practice. So you have to kind of just chip away at the practitioners who have learned to use them as an excuse for helplessness, and just ask them to verify, where exactly does it say that you should be doing it in exactly this way? And they can't cite you chapter and verse. These laws are written in too, overly broad a way or into specific a way, depending, to actually provide direct support for whatever negligence they're engaged in. So, force them to read you the citation.
I have one thing, if I may, sir. I'm former law enforcement, San Diego PD, California. Love the state of Tennessee now. Thank you very much. I want to touch on one thing that I think you said. I'm also the SRO for this school here. Ask your school board how often their law enforcement comes to their school and knows the school. Okay? The reason why is because how do you know what the outlay of the school is? How do they know? They're just going to go off of a map? I have several people that go to this school that I make sure that they walk the building and they're part of Franklin PD. Okay? It saddens me, being the thin blue line, that I have to hear these stories, and I'm sorry. I am sorry. It saddens me that you have been, and this has taken place for your families, but it saddens me that there were men that took the badge and the oath and they did nothing. That kills me. And I'm sorry for your loss. And I appreciate you guys standing up there and saying what you're saying. I've been with Robin for many times, and I've never said anything at any of these. And this is near and dear to my heart. I have 2 students that go to this school. So I have vested interest in this school, but I also have vested interest in what you guys are talking about. Talk to your school boards and ask them, do they train? Trust me, SWAT has to work on Saturdays. There's no reason why they can't train on Saturday at a school. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And let me just say thank you for doing that, and thank you for requiring them to come here and be on campus and know the layout. There's nothing more critical than, if we can prevent these, great, but if something happens, responding law enforcement, every second is potentially another shot, potentially another child or teacher being killed. And so the faster law enforcement can respond, the better. We've chosen in Florida to have armed school resource officers or deputies or guardians on every campus. We have teachers that volunteer for this program and go through the training. I went through the Florida Guardian Program training with 5 teachers. I would run to the danger with any of those 5 teachers because I know if they hear shots, they're running to it and they're gonna stop it. So response is critical. Yeah, make sure law enforcement's familiar with the buildings. The first time they enter the school shouldn't be responding to shots.
Okay. Thank you. That was amazing, and you've done a great service to our community by shedding light on this issue, because Williamson County is much like Parkland. It is the sought-after, affluent county with the crown jewel of schools, and people have no idea that it's here, and it absolutely is here. And I'm going to take the next 10 minutes to tell you where we're at as far as where is Williamson County on restorative justice. Now, the last time I did this for gender ideology, I took us like 30 minutes over. I'm not going to do that this time. But we are going to have a follow-on next week where I can go into a little more detail about Williamson County, but I do want to hit the high points. So that's my role, right? In this whole event, you've got the 2 keynote speakers, the subject matter experts to tell you all about it. The chapter chair is the one that has to say, okay, is it here? It's hard to answer. You have to be a bit of a detective in Williamson County because they don't really post it on their website. We've done searches on WCS, and restorative comes up only in one place, but neither discipline policies, it's not. We've done some FOIA requests for it. So what do we rely on? Parent accounts, teacher accounts, our own reconnaissance, Freedom of Information Act request, records request, plus a little digging once we get a thread to pull on. What's the Williamson County Schools culture? Evidence of that. And then the guidance from the top. What are they saying? So, parent accounts, there's a few of these. I'll run through it. Sometimes we see something on social media and somebody will screenshot it and show it to me. Or somebody will ask a question in a Facebook group. Last fall, there was a first grade kid who traumatized another kid by going into graphic detail about oral sex. And the mom was posting on Facebook in just utter agony because her child was traumatized. No, mine's in 2nd grade. She's definitely not ready for that. So there's, about a year ago, there's a 2nd grader on a school bus that beat the crap out of another 2nd grader. And that was after they just went through Wit and Wisdom, grade 2, module 3, the civil rights module. And it was a black child beating up on a white child. Those seeds were sown in the classroom, by the way. I've had accounts of, or a teacher said that they had to vacate a classroom while The problem child stayed in there and just tore the place up. And last fall, I saw a social media post about a cafeteria fight that went unpunished. In 2019, I had a mom call, and she had binders of information and said that her daughter was sexually harassed in the bathroom a couple of times, to the point that that child did not want to go to school anymore, clearly traumatized, and the school did nothing ultimately. About a year later, they changed her class schedule. And then most recently, this anonymous letter came to us. And it's talking about, I can't read it back there. This isn't over nonsense arguments with kids being kids. This is serious physical and sexual assaults. Step up or resign. This is not okay. These victims may not be your own, but they are ours. We as moms are sick to our stomach and fed up with this reputation of how you both handle severe situations. This is at Jordan Elementary. This is a letter to the principal and the vice principal. Do you think we did a Freedom of Information Act request on Jordan Elementary and anything to do with sexual assault? Yeah, we did. All of these little accounts we have done records requests on. How many has WCS gotten back to this month? 0. Maybe we'll get some by next week when I do the 102 briefing. But as parents, even if it's via an anonymous letter that tells us where to look, it's huge. You're giving us the thread, and we'll pull it, and we'll go down that rabbit hole, but the parents have to help us out, because you have the ear to the ground. Does everybody remember this video from the end of the video that I put together? That's the Williamson County Schools kid. That's Grassland Middle School. That was in May of 2021. I was sitting at Mojo's Tacos place trying to do the final planning for CRT 101 because we just started our chapter, and I get a tip from a parent like, check out this kid's Instagram. There was an arrest at Grassland Middle today. Okay, well, I was kind of focused on CRT at the time, but we looked into it. Tried to find an arrest record, there was none. Tried to find a record of anything, there was none. But you do have this handy email from Carol Birdsong, the communications director of Williamson County Schools, saying, "Hello, Grassland Middle families. Nothing to see here." Now, I bet if you asked Ryan Petty if an email like that went out at Parkland, I'm sure that it did. And all the other schools, nothing to see here. Yeah, there's a social media post, there's a threat called in. It's good. There's an outstanding records request on this incident as well. How else do we know? So this is the reconnaissance part. Parents who visit their schools and then take a photo of all the pride flyers plastered through the hallways, or the woke school counselor announcing their pronouns, whatever. But this is a photo of the school counselor's plaque at Centennial High School, and you have a restorative practice specialist right there on the front. Teacher accounts. It's not a lot of them. Williamson County teachers are terrified to speak up. The few that do either don't work there anymore or take great pains to hide their true identity, which makes it hard because we try to verify everything. But you can look across the nation to see the teacher reports, and a bunch of them were in that video. And if you are a teacher, we'd love to hear your story. There's plenty of ways to speak to us, and we'll maintain your anonymity. So this is a Freedom of Information Act request that we already had on file. This is from an email to Superintendent Jason Golden from Josiah Holland, who's the principal of the Alternative Learning Center. So the ALC is where you send the students that are a little more challenging to deal with. And in it, as you probably know, restorative justice practices are of the utmost importance to me. If you start looking through this guy's social media, he's not kidding. This guy he's on fire for restorative justice. As I've studied restorative practices extensively over the past few years and implemented circles, conferences, and mediation at the ALC, there are several ways to strengthen community on a large scale that involves restorative work. He mentions listening circles. I'd love to help facilitate. He also mentions Drayson Beasley, District 12 school board member, as a partner in this. This is an email about the listening circles and that they have in fact been implemented. And there's an additional email, somehow it spirited itself out of my file folder, but in which a school administrator says, we're gonna do community listening circles in the first period of every day, and I realize it's taking time away from learning, but we'll figure it out on the back end. Literally, these listening circles are more important than teaching your kids to read, write, and do math. So what does a listening circle look like? There's a guide. We have the first and second quarter of the community circle guide. And each day starts with a shallow end and a deep end. And these are just highly leading questions, but if you had a day off from school and you could do anything, what would you do? Okay, fine. But then the deep end is, what's your after-school routine? It's kind of digging into your family's personal life. These are very leading questions. What is a red flag that turns you away from a friend? I mean, should that be how we start our day in school? If you could fix any of the world's problems today, which would you choose? If you could change one event in history, what would it be? This is more important than reading, writing, and math. And it's all social emotional learning, by the way. Do you think honesty is the best policy, or is ignorance bliss? Tracking the teachers. So, I mean, it used to be teachers worked in synergy with the principal, and all of those people worked in synergy with the parents. It was all one team. And now that whole thing is broken up because you've got all these reporting, mandates and statistics, and do we look good, and teachers take care of it yourself. But this is Megan Sanders, principal of Centennial High School, and she starts an email chain saying, how do I track teacher referrals in, I believe it's Skyward? And they're like, well, what are you talking about? Student, and they're like, no. She says, I meant discipline referrals. Is there a way to pull Skyward discipline so I can see how many times a discipline referral was submitted by a teacher? Okay, well, where's this going? She's not looking at the student, she's looking at the teacher. The teacher is being second guessed. Yeah, so she sent me this. I emailed her back and asked for the race column to show for all students. I know who is B, but I want it on the report. Definitely some patterns and implicit bias going on. Josiah Holland responds, wow, this is good data. So does that teacher feel backed up? The teacher has been disincentivized to discipline a student of color because everybody who's tracking her numbers is second guessing, and who knows if she got a talking to or not. So here is Mr. Josiah Holland, his social media profiles. Restorative practitioner on his Twitter, and then on his LinkedIn, more restorative practice stuff. And oh, by the way, he's on the Tennessee Governor's Advisory Council for Alternative Education. Yay! Another great choice by Bill Lee. Okay. And then if you go to so this is the one mention where Williamson County Schools website mentions Alternative Learning Center. Restorative Justice, and it's here at the Alternative Learning Center. Working with our students, the ALC uses the Restorative Practices Framework to empower students. And then it goes on. The purpose of restorative practices teach students to build community, manage conflict, and repair harm caused by personal choices. How about just discipline? So then, okay, let's look for clues in the Williamson County Schools culture. Now that kid at Grassland Middle, as far as I know, he's still there. But what about, is it Franklin High now? But what about the adults surrounding your child? What's the culture there? Well, does everybody remember the janitor that was hiding in the ceiling of the girls' restroom? Which school was that? Do you remember? Scales. And he was doing acts up there, watching the girls use the restroom. And it was a while before they found him. Turns out he was an illegal immigrant, too. It also turns out that there's some parents telling me that they knew about it for a while. Then you've got this guy, Jonathan Ulrich. He was teaching first grade at Fairview Elementary. He was the 2020 Teacher of the Year and was arrested last year on 27 counts, 2 of them being child rape, teaching the first grade. He had been shuffled around Williamson County Schools. If you look at this report right here, he taught at Chapman's Retreat, served as assistant principal at Heritage Middle and Bethesda Elementary. He also worked in the central office for a time, and there's a sexual harassment complaint filed against him. And then he went to teach the first grade. So what's the Williamson County Schools culture? Is it accountability and discipline for the teachers and administrators as well, or are we just shuffling people around, making our numbers look good? This is a briefing given in 2019, the CCC meeting. I'm not sure what this CCC is. I forgot to look it up. But you can see here in the corner, there is Mr. Jason Golden himself giving this briefing. And of course, everybody is just hyper-focused on race. He's breaking down the race numbers. And even though we can't find it on this website, here we are. The tiered approach to system, to intervention and behavior. Student discipline examples. Restorative practices. Who doesn't think it's in Williamson County? Now, the other thing in Tennessee is it may not be called restorative practices, but there's also trauma-informed practices. And you see that mentioned here in the adverse childhood experiences slide. And of course, just like Broward, just like all those other schools, Williamson County Schools is hyper-fixated on its numbers and its reporting. What are our disciplinary numbers look like? How does it stack up in ethnicities? How are specific student groups stacking up? How are we stacking up against the state and nationally? Numbers, 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 numbers. So, and my answer to you is, yeah, it's here. It's absolutely here. It's a little harder to find. If you go to Metro's website, you find it like that. Metro's proud of it. Williamson County, they keep it a little more, they fly that flag a little lower. But it's there. So what can you as a parent do? Well, if you want to head off another Parkland shooting or fill-in-the-blank shooting, you have to get involved. Because the only one in this mess, aside from a couple really good school board members, especially the ones in this room, is the parent. The numbers reporting people, the counselors, the restorative practitioner, they are not invested in the safety of your student like you are. And like Ryan Petty said, they can go to to school and learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, but if they don't come home, what's the point? So parents have got to get involved. And step one is to get informed and to understand this. Because when you go talk to those people and you can talk about restorative justice and the statistics that go with it better than they can, that's something. You'll put them back on their heels because they assume parents don't know anything. They really assume that we're dumb. Governor Lee himself assumed that I wasn't very smart. He said, I got all my information from social media. Has he seen my gender ideology flowchart? Like 50 hours of research right there. So, our next toolkit is the Restorative Justice Toolkit. Step one was this live stream is going to be posted to it, and that toolkit will go live. And then over the course of the rest of what we have left in this month, we're just going to keep adding things. So Ryan Petty's Florida Board of Ed documents and policies, they're going to be up there. We'll make sure that they're super easy to find. We try very hard to put everything at your fingertips, and if you find something that we don't have, let us know, and we'll put it up there. And I hope you check out our other toolkits as well. So I try to do this at a high level, and we're running a little long, but not as bad as last time. But to go into the restorative justice practices themselves, there's a lot of acronyms. You got the multi-tiered system of support, you got which is the MTSS, the PDIS, you've got these circles. It's more complex than just talking about this isn't a good idea. And I want to equip you guys with all of those details and those slides and those graphics so that you know exactly what to look for, so that you're the smartest person in the room when it comes to talking to school administrators about this stuff or talking before the school board about this stuff. So we're having a Restorative Justice 102. It's on Zoom. It's totally free. It's with Scarlett Valdez of Parents Defending Education. She did a really good presentation to Hamilton County Moms for Liberty a couple of weeks ago. Hamilton County is dealing with a major restorative justice push. There's an entity down there called CALEB, which has got north of $75,000 in grants to implement restorative justice practices even greater in Hamilton County. And I watched her presentation. It's really good. She's going to do it again, and that's on January 30th next week at 6 p.m. And then I will re-go through, maybe we'll get some records requests back between now and then from Williamson County Schools, and I'll have some new information for you. So you can follow us on various social media. We try to keep you informed and push information out. And then also, for events like these, if you find them of value, please consider a donation to our chapter. The $15 a ticket, we had to up it just a little bit. It still doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover the airfare and the hotels and the rental car and the venue fee. We've done a really good job of keeping our prices low, but anything that you can do to help us out, we've got at least 3 more 101 events to close out the school year for parents, and I'm so excited about the speakers that we're bringing. These events are going to be great. But I'm going to save those announcements for later. Too excited. That is all I have tonight. I want to thank you all for coming and giving of your time and getting smart on these issues. Thank you.
You up when you've lost everything.